Hello, my name is Jared Hennings. We have a Black History Month committee here at Lewis and Clark Community College that includes Dr. Sean Hill, Vice President of Student Engagement, and Crystal Robinson, Director of our Upward Bound program. In planning our Black History Month calendar, in past years we've programmed theater, music, various speakers. But what has been a foundation throughout many years has been Eric Robinson's guided tours of Underground Railroad locations in our community. Under normal circumstances, we've arranged for a 55-seat coach bus, and routinely, you, the community, have responded affectionately. The bus normally is almost full each and every year. So even in this pandemic, we wanted to continue that effort, and we're offering this viewpoint utilizing the same premise, Eric's commentary with a backdrop of videos capturing some of the exteriors of these notable locations. We hope you enjoy this peek at our Riverbend community during Lewis and Clark Community College's commitment to Black History Month.
Good evening. His name was Harry. According to a newspaper called the Western Intelligencer, he lived in Milton, Illinois, on the banks of the Wood River. And in about 1820, he disappeared. His owner thought he had escaped. This Harry, who lived in Milton, Illinois, along the Wood River, ran away as a slave. The Milton area is what was Milton, Illinois. You might have been there before, on the banks of the Wood River. In the 1820s, an escaped slave coming from Illinois, or through Illinois on the Underground Railroad, traveled a variety of different ways. Originally, there were 4 different sites that were very important to the Underground Railroad as far as the state of Illinois is concerned. One was Quincy, up across from Hannibal. If you remember the story about Jim and the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Quincy was where he was headed. From Quincy, the escaped slave traveled due east to Chicago. Another location was down in Chester, Illinois, not far from the old part of the state. Chester, Illinois provided the avenue for escape for slaves in the boot heel, people who grew cotton. And they traveled northeast toward Chicago. Then there's Cairo, Illinois, deep south. Cairo is so far south, so deep south, that, as some people pointed out, was more southern, most southern towns. Let us all remember that originally the film In the Heat of the Night was shot in southern Illinois, because southern Illinois was more obviously and more definitively southern than the Delta in Mississippi. And there's finally Alton, which concerned itself with slaves coming from St. Louis. There were also slaves in Illinois who were domiciled in the state. Just because Illinois was a free state did not mean that they did not have slaves here. Illinois did. The thing that slaves faced in Illinois was ownership, the right of ownership. They could not be sold in Illinois, but somebody can own a slave in Illinois. And when we talk about southern Illinois, including Metro East, we're talking about slave territory. The ways in which slaves traveled through places like Alton was through southern territory, was a method that they used called the Underground Railroad. There's a lot of ways to talk about the Underground Railroad. Probably the simplest way to talk about it was a method by which the slaves moved from here, where they were situated, to here where they were free. Just very simply, from where they were situated to where they could be free. And sometimes that meant just a few towns away. At other times, that meant as far north as Canada. The years varied based on that. In the 1820s, somebody like Harry just had to move from Milton to Sault. That's all he had to do. But in the 1850s, his descendants had to get to Canada by way of Chicago, which is how all of the Underground Railroad lines in Illinois ended up. 1820s, how do you get from where you were to where you'd want to be? It's rather interesting about the Underground Railroad. A lot of our Underground Railroad sites were located near streams, such as the Piesaw Creek, the Wood River, and Pearl Creek. I know you've been to Pearl Creek before. Have you ever been to Fast Eddie's? Fast Eddie's is right above the Pearl Creek. For the escaped slaves traveling from West Alton, Pearl Creek was a conduit to get to Upper Alton. In Upper Alton, in the 1820s, the one site they started their journey on and heading toward freedom was the priest's retreat at 2423 Edwards, a Greek revival house that didn't have any secret spaces, didn't have any secret chambers, didn't have any secret rooms. What it did have was a priest for the original Catholic Church in Alton, St. Matthew's Parish. By the way, the original Catholic Church, oddly enough, is now the Unitarian Church here in Alton. The priest who was located in St. Matthew's Parish most likely was an immigrant. Most of the Catholic priests that we had in the 1820s in the United States came from places like Ireland and from Germany. The German Catholics, generally speaking, were dead set against slavery. The Irish are a little less opposed to slavery. They're more likely to be supporters of the right to own property. They were human beings. It was something they were familiar with in Ireland. But when we talk about the priest who was located in St. Matthew's Parish, the stories exist that he would hide the escaped slaves in the priest's retreat, in his residence, with him there. We go there now, and it's mostly in the middle of town, very much the middle of town, with a lot of traffic. But in the 1820s, it was mostly woods, almost all woods. And in the 1820s, the attitude was, if a structure was used for religious purposes, one dared not go and investigate it looking for a fugitive. We respected fugitives, and we respected fugitives rather, who hid themselves in church buildings. We tried to get them some other way. And some of the church buildings were pretty well known for hiding escaped slaves. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, for example, since its founding in 1787 in Philadelphia, was used to hide escaped slaves. Many of the Underground Railroad activity began in that type of church activity. Well, if you are a person looking for a fugitive slave, wouldn't you think to look at a black church? Perhaps so. Take a look, for example, at New Bethel Rocky Fork AME Church from the 1850s and 1860s. That church structure seemed to have helped slaves escape. But people were very, very much aware that if a person was found helping a slave escape, and you're a free person of color, you ran the risk of being sold into slavery. For a Catholic priest, hiding an escaped slave would just be unimaginable that he would do this to break the law. So even if they thought a fugitive slave was in the structure, generally speaking, any slave catcher trying to find him, even Harry's owner, would think twice about barging in to the Catholic priest's residence and demanding to be let in. In the 1820s, this stop on the Underground Railroad had another stop nearby, which would help ferry the slave going north or going out of town. In the 1820s, that was the old Rock House, 2705, 2707 College Avenue. You will note that in that building, it has a modern addition to it, and you will also note the main structure facing College Avenue has stone of the first story. It's different from stone of the second story. It's because it was originally 1.5 stories. It was an inn serving people who were associated with Shirtlift College, what is now SIU Dental School. That inn had a lot of people living in it, going about in it, surviving in it. And according to the research that we have on Underground Railroad sites in Alton, that inn hid escaped slaves in the base of the central chimney. So, why would you hide somebody in a central chimney warming oven, which was the base of that chimney? One of the reasons why you would do that is if the chimney were not being used, such as during the summer. Nobody bakes during the summer. It's baked during this time of the year when it's cold and you need to get warm. You need to warm the building. Best way to warm the building, start baking when it's even today. How many of you intend to bake during this nice snowstorm that's hitting us in February? Well, here you were, a person who was an escaped slave. And you go to that building, and you might say it is summer, when it is rather warm and nobody's baking. The persons in that building who worked in that inn, the bakers, or more likely, somebody like Thaddeus Hurlburt, who lived at that inn and taught at Shirtlift College, would help the slave escape inside the base of the central chimney, inside of the warming oven. A man of about 6 foot can hide in there. Do you know anybody 6 foot tall? Yeah. I know somebody 6 foot tall. Of course, I have a bit more dough in that. I would not be able to hide in it very well. But at any rate, somebody of natural size, of regular size, you could hide in the base of the central chimney in a nice warming oven. Kind of hide it like this until it was safe to go outside. And remember, this is all woods. Upper Alton was not at all well developed in the 1820s. In the 1820s, as a matter of fact, Upper Alton was, with the exception of Shirtlift College, was wilderness. Let us remember that back in the 1820s, in Wood River Township, where modern-day Bethalto is, there were still Native Americans in that area. Some of them descendants of the Paiso Indians. And they would be in a position, as they did in the Wood River Massacre, of attacking any European who was traveling along the road between Upper Alton and Edwardsville. Wilderness. You needed to come wherever you could find shelter. A lot of people came to shelter in that old rock house, the inn. Somebody expecting an escaped slave? Perhaps they might sit and talk to them. They might not realize that they were actually an escaped slave. Why? You might ask, wouldn't they have a picture? Well, they didn't have photography back then. Unlike this nice state ID that I have, which has my picture in it. I do have less gray hair than this, believe it or not. This is not what they had to identify anybody. All they had was a general description. Harry's general description just described him as being middle-sized and middle-complected. It could be anybody. When Harry escaped, the document that he was really interested in having were freedom papers. Not as elaborate as my ID, not as elaborate as your passport, but merely as elaborate as this receipt from Schnucks. And that's all it was, a receipt. The free blacks in Illinois, when Harry escaped, treasured these receipts. It was a sign that they had posted a bond, about $500, with the county official. And they got this receipt, which guaranteed that they were free people. It's very much different than what you had in Missouri. In Missouri, free blacks received a deed, an affidavit sworn before a judge, that was very much like a deed of property, a real estate deed. But for free blacks in Illinois, you just got the receipt. Oh, and by the way, remember we're talking about Illinois? You paid $500 cash. To give you an idea what that's a bit worth, that's the equivalent of $40,000 in today's funds. $500 cash to an Illinois official. Does anybody have an idea where that money went? State didn't say where it would go, but everybody knew where that ended up. County officials were known to, keep their hands in the till. Now, in exchange for this receipt, you became a free person. However, if someone were to have this receipt, and if I as a white person were to ask for it, they had to present the receipt of their freedom to me. And if I did this, and this, and this, and this to the receipt, and did one of these numbers, there was nothing a free black could do at all. I could claim that free black was my slave. So here was Harry, or whoever he was, hiding in that nice warming oven, knowing very well that the thing was more valuable was not this receipt that anybody can tear up into paper, into shreds, but rather the word that somebody would help him. Whoever it was that hid him in the old rock house, obviously, covered up quite a bit more than just poor Harry hiding in the warming oven. Yeah, obviously, actually, provided some interference. They made sure that other people acquiesced and left him alone. They did a lot of things in that quiet conspiracy. That was how people facilitated escapes of slaves. The priests obviously did in the old priest retreat. So did the baker in the warming oven. Then they escaped from 2705, 2707 college. And remember, this is all woods. This is country, wilderness. And they walked up what is now Clawson Street. And they were headed, actually, outside of the village of Upper Alton. And there was this house. It was a house that I heard about when I was in elementary school, at Horace Mann's school. One of the boys then in my class, Douglas Bach, lived in that house. So I referred to it by that family's name, the Bach House. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Bach were their name when I was a child. 2626 Judson. A rather interesting house. Rather nondescript. But this is a house that at the time, in the 1820s, was just inside the village of Alton, of Upper Alton rather. This house that had two staircases. One staircase that went from the front door into the second floor where the bedrooms were, and another staircase that connected the kitchen with the attic. The attic, I don't know if it's like that now, but I remember the way the box kept it. The attic had rough-hewn wood timbers in the rafters, made from trees in the immediate vicinity. And you can imagine them being cut down and planed into the rafters that they would put for that roof. 2626 Judson, middle of town, but not back in the 1820s. In fact, if you traveled only about 2 blocks north of that location, north of 2626 Judson, toward instead Bostwick Street. And when you got to Bostwick Street, at one time, that was the edge of town. At one time, when I was a child, and Doug Bach and I traveled along those streets, headed towards my house in the Saloon neighborhood, the sidewalk on Bostwick Street turned south. It did not go north when it reached Seminary Avenue. South meant towards College Avenue, back towards town. In fact, when I was a young boy, I was a newspaper carrier in Saloon. And when I was a newspaper carrier, the streets past Bostwick on Seminary onward were rural delivery. They had rural free delivery mailboxes. It had this nice big ditch, a drainage ditch for a person. And that was the way the street was, the road was, from Bostwick Street all the way up to Seiler Road in Fosterburg. It was all country. Back in the time period, way back when, there were farms located not far from the corner of Bostwick and Seminary. The Western Military Academy was located just on the edge of town, what is now Mississippi Valley Christian School. Countryside. Well, once upon a time, that was just outside of town. And in the 1820s, the community of Salu was developing. Salu is the free black community that is part of Upper Alton. Upper Alton came to grow around it, but for a long time it was just outside of town. And when we are talking about an escaped slave moving from here to here, because what they had here, this remnant, was not enough to keep them free. Being outside of town actually had value. The escaped slaves that lived, and with the free blacks that lived in Salu, interacted with the free blacks in Wood Station. People like the Johnsons and the Ballingers. Their church was Salem Baptist Church on the corner of Seiler and Wood Station Road. You can actually see James and Matilda Ballinger's grave marker. And you probably know some Ballingers. If you know any black people in Alton, you know any black people in Alton? If you know any black people in Alton, you're bound to meet somebody that's related to a Ballinger, because Ballingers are a large family. James and Matilda Ballinger began with 17 children when they arrived in Illinois from Missouri, and each of those 17 children had large families, and their grandchildren had large families, and so on, and so on, and so on, until every Tom, Dick, and Harry that you run into in Alton is related to a Ballinger. Now, there's possibilities to think about this. One person might have had all those children, and maybe that they were my claimed relatives, my play cousins, my brother and sister, my nephew from out of town, someone like Harry, who suddenly showed up and needed a place to stay, who might have needed a reason to stay with a family that everybody knew as a way of protecting them, because $500 just doesn't go far enough for us today. And so, in Wood Station, there were a couple hundred people. Back before the Civil War, it was more common in Illinois to find free people of color living in rural areas than it was to live in town. As a matter of fact, Illinois had only 4 communities of free blacks living in town that had a population of 100 or more. They were Quincy, Jacksonville, Springfield, and Alton. The Alton free blacks lived in what is now Hunterstown, a community that was founded by Charles Hunter. Most of the free blacks who lived in Hunterstown were like Alfred Shavers. They worked as stevedores in the river traffic of Illinois, of the Mississippi River. When you talk about a community like Edwardsville, my ancestors were among the first free blacks to live in Edwardsville. 1840s, there were only 30 of free blacks in Edwardsville. In the 1830s, more free blacks in the Edwardsville area lived in Pinal Colony. Population of over 300 lived there in the 1840s. Rocky Fork, which has the New Bethel Rocky Fork AME Church, which we have its subsequent building located. Rocky Fork was the center of a community of about 100 free blacks living on the site of what is now the Boy Scout camp, Warren Levis. That was originally a sawmill. When you lived in rural areas, well, you were lucky that if somebody did this to you, and if you were, excuse me, I'm not used to going to my knees, you will understand. If you were relegated to picking up the pieces in rural communities, your neighbors helped you. Somebody tore up my freedom papers. And if he wants to take me in as an escaped slave, he'd have to fight my neighbor Jay here, who might pull out his gun and say, this is a free person. So something like this actually had the backing of somebody who could do one of these things and say, like hell, you've taken that free man. Let me give you an example of where that actually did happen. You all know about Calhoun County. Well, back in the 1850s, this is a bit different from Harry's 1820s, but back in the 1850s, a man named George Washington, who lived in Otterville. He was a free person of color in Otterville, Illinois, in Jersey County, just north of Grafton, was looking for a horse that had been stolen and taken across river to Hardin. While he was in Hardin, someone saw him and claimed he was an escaped slave. Well, it was lucky for George Washington that his neighbors were also looking for their horses that had been stolen away when they heard that a runaway, you know what I'm talking about, was in the sheriff's office. The sheriff was going to send them back to slavery. They came there and said, this man is free. This man is a free man. Leave him alone. And the sheriff did. The word of your neighbor actually was beneficial. It actually paid to have neighbors close contact with you. So when we talk about Wood Station, for example, or we could talk about Rocky Fork, or we could talk about Pinal Colony, or any of a number of communities, when you were an escaped slave or free black in an area where people knew who you were, knew who your family was, or accepted that you're a member of a family that they knew, they defended you in such a way that Paper didn't. And so, free blacks in Wood Station existed for a long time, still exists today. The oldest family farm that in operation in Illinois is the farm of the Johnsons. Remember, a family that's a part of the Ballinger family. The people existed in close contact with others, as friends, as neighbors, as collaborators. They didn't care what you looked like as long as you could put up a barn and help bring in the harvest and put out a fire and help the children if they happened to be colicky, which some of us had a reputation for being. And here they were in Wood Station, living in close contact with one another. So here you are, Harry, a free black, escaping. 1820s, you might get to Wood Station and decide to live in with those people there. Now, of course, Harry didn't stay. Harry couldn't stay. He liked it, but by about the 1850s, the fugitive slave law had been enacted that said any escaped slave in the United States had to be returned to his master, and the state would be compelled to help a person acquire their escaped slave. So what you saw was populations in places like Wood Station move even further north to get out of the escaped slaves' peril of the master coming and getting them. Harry's master was in Illinois, 1820s, 1850s. He didn't forget that Harry had escaped. Give you an example of something that doesn't forget. Let's talk about that SUV you have in the parking lot right now. What would it be for you if you were suddenly to leave your place of employment, go out to your parking lot, and find your SUV is not there? What would you do? Among other things, you couldn't record anything that you had said because you'd probably be very angry. But among other things, you would seek someone somewhere to help you recover your vehicle, especially if you see your vehicle being driven by somebody else, or see your vehicle parked in somebody else's driveway. Got the picture? Negroes who are owned as slaves were like SUVs today. They were expensive. A Negro such as myself, at my age, 55, might not catch much of a price. But if I were, say, in my 30s, in my teens, especially if I were a female in my teens, you know what I mean? I could fetch a very big price. And a slaveholder who had a slave escape was that valuable, would do anything to get him back. This fugitive slave law made it possible for anyone who had a slave escape on them to get that slave returned to them. And they paid a big price for that. And mind you, back in that time period, they didn't have photography. So they could probably get anyone and describe them as rather haughty and gray-haired and paunchy and with a mustache and short, and you might get me. You might also get Henry Louis Gates. You're stuck with who you got, whether you like it or not. Harry might have wanted to escape. Some people did. Some of the people who escaped from Alton in the 1820s, by the 1850s, they were going toward Canada. They were going to Chicago. They were going to Racine, Wisconsin. And there they would probably hope that nobody finds them. Trail runs cold. Or that somebody else was captured to fulfill the need of the slaveholder. But here you are in Wood Station, and you get scared. Where do you go to next? From Wood Station, the logical location is to head up towards Brighton, Illinois. The house in Brighton, which was occupied by the town doctor, Thomas Brown, actually helped slaves escape. Thomas Brown worked in concert with his in-laws, Peter and Charity Van Arsdale, who lived on the other side of the railroad tracks in Brighton. They helped slaves escape to head to Springfield, Illinois. From Springfield, they headed towards Chicago. And in Chicago, a man named John Jones, who was the leader of the free black community in Illinois. He was also a major Republican, by the way. It seems that the Chicago Daily Tribune's founders, the McCormick and Medill families, were very active in helping slaves escape and opposing slavery, and going so far as providing printing services to somebody like John Jones, who wanted to publish pamphlets. But John Jones, from his shop in Dearborn, put escaped slaves on ships heading through the Great Lakes. And then along the Great Lakes he'd travel until he got to Detroit. At Second Baptist Church in Detroit, the Vigilant Committee, led by a man named George D. Bantista, the Vigilant Committee were a group of free blacks from Kentucky mostly, who helped slaves escape from Detroit into Canada. And Canada didn't need this. Canada didn't recognize slaves being held, human beings being held by other human beings. They're more likely to ignore the pleas of someone from Missouri, a family from Illinois, to have their slaves returned to them. You can always hide any other place. You can change your name. Harry probably did, regardless of the year that he escaped, 1820s or 1850s. The Underground Railroad operated in a variety of different ways, variety of different operations. But there were some basic ways that they did that. Assuming a personality, depending upon the word of somebody people trusted, hiding in plain sight. All those things played a part. Even when your documents didn't help you.
We thank you for being a part of our Black History Month celebration here at Lewis and Clark Community College. We only hope that you found some enjoyment, learned something you didn't know before, and realized how important our history is in shaping who you are as a person and who we are as a people. From Lewis and Clark Community College, this is Jared Hennings saying thank you for joining us and hope to see you next year, hopefully in person. Goodbye for now.